pleasure to be here, and thanks everybody for taking the time to join us here online. I know we've all had too much Zoom, way too much Zoom over the last 2 years. So I'm a political geographer. I want to make that clear because some of you are political scientists or maybe lawyers, but bear in mind that I'm a political geographer. And here, and in general in my work, I'm primarily interested in how states use space and geography and borders in creative ways to keep unwanted migration out of their territory, and how these spatial strategies have specific impacts of groups who are in situations of risk or vulnerability, such as unaccompanied migrant children, asylum seekers, or refugees. Today, I'm going to be presenting some partial results from an ongoing project on the harmonization of maritime search and rescue across the southern European border. As Megan mentioned, some of the things that I will be discussing here today came out in a paper a few months ago in the journal Geopolitics, but the project continues. It is funded by FRQSC and SSHRC, and we are currently interviewing senior members of the Spanish armed forces who are part of these processes that I will be discussing today. So the question that underlies this, my presentation today, is what is the relationship between maritime search and rescue and migration control, and how is this relationship changing? It is a tricky question to answer because things are changing very quickly, and we do not have access to a lot of the information that we would need, but it is an important question. And to begin to answer it, I have organized my intervention in 4 main sections. I'm going to start in the Mediterranean today and argue that national search and rescue systems have become an important element in the European Union's fight against unwanted migration, which of course is a very large category. In the second section, I'm going to address the question of what exactly is maritime search and rescue and what it looks like in the region. And I then turn towards this transition to a new approach to maritime search and rescue. I argue that for a very long time, maritime search and rescue and migration control have been 2 completely separate different areas of policy areas until recently, and that only began to change in the last decade and a half. In this section, that I've titled Search and Rescue versus the Border, I put my findings in conversation of Alison Mounce's most recent book, The Death of Asylum, and I argue that the deployment of SAR systems to halt unwanted migration plays an important role in the abandonment of states' legal obligation towards people on the move. Finally, I'm going to focus on a case that has received relatively less attention. I think we're all familiar with NGOs in the Central Mediterranean, perhaps even with what's happening in Greece today, but less so with the Spanish case, even though Spain has been receiving sustained high levels of sea migration since the 1990s. So in the second part of the presentation, I'm really going to focus on what has happened in Spain and what it means, what are the implications for, in general, migration control in Southern Europe. So my main argument is that maritime search and rescue has become integrated, has become part of an instrument of migration control. And this has happened through 3 main strategies. The first one is the militarization, even in areas where search and rescue was not militarized. The second one is externalization, so the delegation of search and rescue responsibilities to countries of origin and transit. And the third one is supranationalization, so the transfer of responsibilities to, mainly here I'm thinking about Frontex, but not only Frontex. All these changes combined have resulted in a rapidly evolving maritime geopolitics of the sea border, with consequences for all migrants, but with consequences that are particularly harmful for protected groups such as asylum seekers, refugees, minors, etc. So I'm going to start with what is maritime SAR? There are several international conventions that are relevant for this, to the way human life is protected at sea, including the SALAS Convention, Safety of Life at Sea Convention, and the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. But the convention that is at the heart of rescue work and at the heart of my work is the SAR Convention, the Search and Rescue Convention, which was signed in 1975 and entered into force in 1985, although each country ratified and implemented at different points. For example, in Spain, Spain implemented it in 1993. The objective of this convention was and is to create a global system for search and rescue at sea, also in land, but here I'm mostly concerned about sea, so that all emergencies where human life is at risk are addressed and the loss of human life is minimized as much as that is possible. The convention does two main things. The first thing is to divide the world's seas and oceans into independent search and rescue regions, SRRs, which is the areas where signatory states have, in this case, European member states, EU member states, have willingly acquired the legal obligation to provide assistance to people on boats in distress. It's a little bit the superposition of land territoriality onto the sea for the purposes of protecting human life. The second, for protecting all human life. The second implication is that this convention requires signatory states to put in place a system of their choice to address these emergencies. So if you have been following the news, for example, a couple of days ago, a Spanish fishing vessel, the Villa de Pitancho, sank off the coast of Newfoundland, and the Canadian Armed Forces they've stopped now, and we're looking for survivors. And this is exactly the situation that they had in mind when they created this convention. The boundaries of the search and rescue regions are self-reported by signatory states, the states that have signed the Search and Rescue Convention. And usually when there's fluid communication between neighboring states, this is not much of an issue. Here you have a map of the search and rescue regions in the Mediterranean, and wherever things are blue, everything is good. The problems are all green. Green are shared zones of responsibility. So an area where countries have agreed that, if there's an emergency, they will coordinate the rescue efforts. The orange zone that you see here and that you will see in the following map too is where two states claim responsibility over the same zone, an overlap that usually points, actually in the case that I'm going to talk about today, definitely point to a territorial conflict, in this case between Greece and Turkey. And finally, the gray areas that you see here are areas that are not functional. So either the countries have not signed the convention, or they have signed a convention, but they haven't put in place a national search and rescue system. So if anything happens there, a neighboring state can come in with their permission and address the emergency, or nobody addresses the emergency. Because the second part of my presentation is going to focus on the Spanish case, please indulge me here a bit. And this is a map that focuses on the Spanish search and rescue region. And here you see that this region mostly borders the Moroccan region. There's a part in green that you see there on the top. That's a shared zone of responsibility that will become very important in the second part of my intervention. And then there's a second zone in orange, which is an overlapping zone. I said that usually these areas, the overlapping zones, point to conflict in territorial claims. And this is definitely the case here, where this conflict is linked, very closely linked, to a territorial conflict over the status of the Western Sahara region. It's also linked to the resources that lie under the sea, which are very important. So Morocco unilaterally defined its territorial waters and its zone of responsibility in April 2020, right after the pandemic began. So you may be wondering why I'm showing you all these maps, besides the fact that I'm a geographer and I really like maps. But there are other reasons that are important. And the main one is that I want to bring your attention to the fact that search and rescue regions are not the same as territorial waters. Territorial waters are which are under the sovereignty of the state, are much, much smaller usually, and take only a fraction of the search and rescue zone. So what does this mean? This means that neither immigration law or other domestic law applies in much of the search and rescue region. These are international waters, and this is important. Okay, so going back to the search and rescue convention, as I mentioned before, while providing search and rescue services is a legal obligation that these states have acquired, how they do that is up to each individual state. And there have been three main approaches. Now, I want to insist that this list is not exhaustive and the approaches are not mutually exclusive. They often coexist. The most common approach that we are probably all familiar with is the military approach, where armed forces and militarized state security forces are responsible. So, for example, Coast Guards, National Coast Guards, which are under the purview or closely linked with close operational links to the Ministry of Defense, the armed forces, etc. The second one is non-state search and rescue NGOs. So why do I say these are not mutually exclusive? Because if we think, for example, about the case of the Central Mediterranean, we see that the state has military forces that are responsible for these operations, but we also have NGOs. And until 2017, in fact, these NGOs were asked to assist because the Italian state was overwhelmed. They didn't have the resources to perform these operations. So they invited these NGOs, and now since 2017, they tried to kick them out, but now they have, historically, they've had these like ambivalent, sometimes confrontational relationship, but they coexist in the Central Mediterranean and to a lesser extent in the Eastern Mediterranean. And then you have non-military state actors. And here you have the case of France and notably the case of Spain, which I will be discussing today. Something that I have briefly mentioned before, but that will become relevant for the rest of my presentation, is that the SAR Convention invites cooperation between states. So if your neighboring state has a search and rescue region, but doesn't have the resources to carry out rescue operations in that area, you are encouraged to bring your rescue assets to that area with the authorization of the neighboring state. The truth is, it doesn't matter who does the rescue. Like, honestly, if the rescue is being done, it shouldn't matter who does it. But what we are seeing in this like fight, and entre beaucoup de guillemets, is that these rescues are not taking place. In fact, what we have seen, especially since 2017, is that countries with perfectly functional search and rescue regions are choosing to decrease the resources that they devote to their national search and rescue services, or they are moving their life-saving assets away from the regions where migrants are likely to be. We also have reports, as you may know, of military search and rescue personnel, especially in Greece, putting migrant people, including very young children, into rafts and let them drift away. So this way, life-saving services are denied to poor foreigners who are crossing the border illegally, while the country can say that actually they still respect the terms of the convention. Today, we also had, like today, we also had confirmation of something that we already knew, but we didn't have evidence, which was that the Greek Coast Guard has been bringing people who were already inland out to sea and throwing them into the water. Not even bothering putting them in a raft without an engine, because it would be too problematic to justify the expense afterwards. I don't know if you have read the report that came out today, but it's quite something. Anyways, because some of these services are still in place, countries can claim that they're still respecting their legal obligations. And here is where I want to bring in Mounce's book to, which does not focus on maritime search and rescue, but offers, I argue, valuable insight into the consequences that these actions have for the survival, not just of individual asylum seekers, but for the international protection system. In her book, Mounce argues that states are strategically using geography to undermine the right accrued when a person lands on sovereign territory, including the right to claim asylum. And Mounce uses Judith Butler's work on precarious lives as a springboard to dig into how the new border territorialities and materialities contribute to the physical, the ontological, and the political death of asylum and asylum seekers. So as I said, Mounce focuses on islands, but here I want to argue that the way search and rescue is articulated at sea is also part of the broader process that she studies. In fact, the cooptation of national search and rescue systems for the purposes of migration control and border control is causing physical deaths, people who are not saved, drown usually. And here, of course, the work of Membe comes to mind. So Membe describes contemporary borders as, quote, the organized violence that underpins both contemporary capitalism and our world order in general. Borders are spaces of non-connection which deny the very idea of a shared humanity, end of quote, which is what happens when you choose to save the life of a Northern European tourist, but deny assistance to somebody who comes from Morocco or from Algeria or from Turkey. The dismantling of universal, meaning saving everybody's lives, search and rescue systems is also contributing to the ontological death of the international protection system. What we do not see, because migrants die or disappear at sea, or because they're kept in spaces of transit, does not exist, and therefore does not matter. And finally, these transformations contribute to the erasure of people and the denial of the violence they experience. So in other words, the political death of the asylum system. Now, this is like a general observations about what is happening along the southern European border, but the question that I'm going to address for the rest of my intervention here is, what does this look like on the ground? And here is where I think the Spanish case can help us understand what is going on at the border. As I said before, Spain ratified the Search and Rescue Convention in 1993. And just trivia information, the person who was responsible for coordinating this effort was Josep Borrell. I don't know if you're familiar with Josep Borrell, but he is the former president of the European Parliament and currently the High Representative of the Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy. And in this role, he's also the head of the European Defense Agency. But in 1993, He was the Minister of Transportation and the Environment in Spain. At the time, migration had begun in the early 90s, but it was not a big issue in Spain. There were a lot of people coming by boat from Morocco, but it wasn't a political issue. Bigger concerns were the safety of Spanish fisherfolk and environmental disasters. There were a few oil spills in northern Spain. You can see a picture here where the state had to recruit volunteers, a lot of university students like myself at the time. I was not at university in 93, but later on, who would just like go on buses to clean the beaches of northern Spain. So this may explain in part where at this time, it's only part of the story, but I don't have time to go into the rest of the story. Instead of placing the responsibilities that came with signing the Search and Rescue Convention on the hands of the military, they created a new agency, a civil agency, non-militarized, who became responsible, who had a triple mandate: address search and rescue responsibilities acquired by the state in the Spanish search and rescue region, increase capacity to respond to environmental disasters, and manage maritime traffic. The agency was created in 1993, and not much changed for them between 1993 and 2018. A lot of things changed around them. There were several, I think 5 different immigration laws that were passed in Spain. The armed forces, the Guardia Civil, which is the equivalent of the RCMP here in Canada, underwent massive internal structural changes to integrate some of the responsibilities that came with the control of the seas, surveillance of the seas. Frontex was created and launched its first ever, and to date, longest running operation in the Canary Islands, the Operation Air. I mean, so many things changed, but the agency just kept chugging along, going around with their orange boats. You can see one there, rescuing whoever was in trouble at sea. They had no operational links to the armed forces or with Frontex beyond very punctual strategic collaborations. Mainly, for example, they suspected that the boat they were going to intercept was trafficking drugs, or there were weapons inside, but otherwise they did not collaborate with them often. When I've talked to other rescue crews, they repeat again and again that the role is to be the ambulances or the firefighters of the sea, in the sense that the role is they see themselves as having an apolitical role. And even though, and they're busy, even though migration is important for this agency, only 10% of rescue crews are actually deployed in areas where there's a lot of migration. The agency is a very uncomfortable actor, as it has become an obstacle in the Spanish government plan to integrate maritime SAR into the broader border apparatus, and also an obstacle into the harmonization of Spanish practices into the larger European context. So with this purpose, the government, which not that it matters, but it's a left government, has used 3 main strategies to get rid of the nuisance. One has been the absorption of SASEMAR's rescue assets through the attrition of the agency rescue crews, which are strongly, vocally opposed to current border policy. The second has been the takeover of rescue responsibilities by military or militarized actors. And the third one is the externalization of rescue responsibilities to Morocco. So the first one is attrition. I just want to highlight, in a previous slide, you saw the different resources that the agency has. I just want to highlight that this is a highly specialized agency with highly specialized personnel with equipment that's even locally adapted to the rescue conditions of each individual port. So rescue crews have the authority to modify vessels to better adapt them to the conditions of their work. A rescue operation in the area between Morocco and southern Spain usually has taken in the past, prior to 2018, between 6 and 8 hours, including travel time. And of those, only 1 to 2 minutes. I've seen these operations, they're incredible. They're able to transfer up to 100 people from a vessel in distress to the rescue vessel within 1 to 2 minutes. The death rate, whenever they intervene, the death rate is really low, but, and this is important, they're super heavily unionized. Not only that, but their union is anarcho-syndicalist, and they're opposed to borders. In their newsletter, it's not like open borders, it's like no borders, it's like class struggle all the way through. So how do you get rid of these people who are talking to the media and saying that you're letting people drown at sea? And who are very successful and very sympathetic and very charismatic. Well, you cut the budget of the agency, you outsource some of the personnel to private companies, you relocate rescue units, you impose a gag so that workers cannot talk to researchers or to the media, and mainly you make their working conditions terrible. So, and also when people retire or you fire them, you do not replace them with permanent positions, but with people on 6-month contracts who are afraid to unionize and make their voices heard. And then you take the boats and you take the helicopters, and you know how it goes. The second strategy is the militarization of rescue, and this has happened in 3 different ways. The first way is domestically within Spain. What has happened is that as SASEMAR has become less able to conduct rescues for the reasons that I have mentioned before, you bring in the equivalent agency that is under the military. So very unhelpfully, that agency is called SASEMAR. So we have SASEMAR and we have SASEMAR. And here, the graphs that you have on the left of the slide, you see the evolution. On the top graph, you have the number of people, and on the bottom graph, you have the percentage of people, so number and percentages. And you can see, especially in the lower graph, how in the Spanish search and rescue zone, we have gone from almost 90% of these operations being performed or carried out by SASEMAR to almost half in 2018, to almost half of them today being carried out by the equivalent of the RCMP, the Guardia Civil, which is part of the armed forces. Perhaps more importantly, though, and this is not on the slide, the government has created a single operative unit, which means that if in the past, SASEMAR was able to coordinate all rescue operations, now this responsibility has been transferred to the armed forces. So even though these assets here are orange, are SASEMAR, the people making the decisions are actually the armed forces. Then another aspect of this militarization is the supranationalization of search and rescue efforts, mostly to Frontex, which is nominally a civil agency, but as we know in its day-to-day work, it has a very militarized modus operandi. This agency in the graph at the bottom, you can see the increase, 10-fold increase of the agency's budget since its creation in 2005 to last year, from 6 million euros to 543 million euros. All this can be, and then I will turn in a second to also the transfer of these responsibilities to militarized or military abroad, notably to Morocco. And all these things, all these changes are justified on these self-evident, I guess, or something that has become a truth, unchecked truth, which is that migration is a threat to national security. Therefore, it is a responsibility of state security forces to protect us against this threat. So I said that there's also a very externalization has become, since I would say 2015, the holy grail of European migration policy, border policy, I should say. And in the case of Spain and search and rescue in Spain, this externalization has mainly, but not only, involved Morocco. Now, there's a long-standing cooperation on migration control since at least the 1990s with Morocco. There's notably a readmission agreement signed between the two countries in 1992 that's still being used today. But this cooperation happened mostly along land borders. And it's notable because there are a lot of territorial conflicts between the two states. This cooperation started increasing, especially in 2018, with Spanish and EU and European Union transfers of up to 700 million euros. And while the Spanish transfers were for the policing of land borders, the European funds have been used mostly to increase Morocco's search and rescue capacity at sea. So there's a division of where these funds go. This comes with a lot of challenges that I will detail in a second, but mainly accountability. We don't know, and transparency. We really don't know what's going on in the Moroccan search and rescue region. But also there's a concern about the protection of human rights, because if the European Union and individual member states are offloading these responsibilities to countries like Morocco or Libya or Turkey, should we be considering this as a violation of European Union's commitment, international commitments for the protection of human rights? If we go back to search and rescue operations, this is what we have seen. I have maps for the Canary Islands, but they're a little bit messier. I think this map shows the evolution it's much more obvious. So here you have southern Spain and the upper part of these maps, and northern Africa on the lower part of the maps. And there's a line. That line is the division of search and rescue zones. You have the Algerian to the right, and then the Moroccan search and rescue region to the left. And you see each point is a search and rescue operation. So you can see how, oh, I forgot, and the yellow area is the shared zone of responsibility, because there's so much movement here. There's like a strip that's shared by both Morocco and Spain. So what we see here is that 2015, 16, 17, 18, we have pretty much exactly a third of the operations carried out by by the Spanish agency, either a third in Moroccan water, the Moroccan search and rescue zone, a third in the shared zone, and a third in the Spanish search and rescue region. You follow me? Then that changes in 2018. That summer, both is when Spain, the European Union, and Morocco decide that things have to change. We have to stop people from coming. And see what happens in 2019, the first year when this cooperation becomes functional, 2020 and 2021. There's basically no search and rescue operations in the Moroccan zone, and less in the shared zone of responsibility. Spanish assets are asked to leave the port and wait 100 meters away from the boat in distress to wait for the Moroccan Navy. This is what's happening here. But the change is huge. And what happens when the Moroccan Navy gets there? We have no idea. Every now and then, especially when Spain or the European Union and Morocco are going to are negotiating fund transfers, we have, like, for example, here, 19,554 people were saved. But where, when, how, who are these people? What happened to these people? We know nothing. Activists in the region, what they do is that whenever they learned of a boat that may have been rescued by the Moroccan Navy, they call, and depending on who answers the phone, they may get the information or not. But you see, the lack of transparency is very concerning. And the European Union and Spain are funding this. So to conclude, what is happening when we look specifically at the Spanish case, but I think this is indicative of what is happening across the southern European border, is that there's a reappropriation of assets that were not linked to the military. They're brought back into militarized search and rescue efforts. There's an externalization of responsibilities, and there's a supranationalization of the responsibilities as well. This combined results in a new political geography of the border, of the sea border, a new territoriality, a new way of governing whatever happens in that area. There's a lack of transparency and accountability, as I said, that is being promoted through European Union and member states' actions. There's a clear violation of international conventions and also international customary law. It is a thing of the sea that if something is if somebody's life is at risk, you will save that life. And finally, and perhaps more concerning because of the broader implications, what we're seeing is the death of the international protection system, the physical, and here again, I go back to Addison's book, which I really like, the physical, ontological, and political death of this system. And that's all. I look forward to your questions and comments. Thank you.